Well, good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming out. And thank you to our wonderful hosts for organizing this event. Because I think it's essential that we carry on talking about these questions. I think there is at this point, and I think we all feel it, a profound fatigue around the theme of COVID. We all wished it would simply go away and we didn't have to deal anymore. And it is a huge relief to be able to be here together, many of us unmasked, many of us now traveling freely around the world. But I think there is a great danger in underestimating the continued risks that it poses, the disease poses to us today. And those risks have become even more urgent and more important in light of the other compounding factors that we currently have to deal with in the world economy. I was asked to assess what the impact of the disease is on the world economy at this moment, what it has been. And part of the difficulty in doing that is actually having a benchmark against which to measure the impact of this disease. And of course, we have history to do that. But in a sense, history has already also delivered us another shock. And this, I think, encapsulates the extraordinary force and complexity of the situation that we're currently in, which is the war. And so this morning, rather than simply asking what is the impact of COVID and what has it been, I've been challenged to try and provide to you an overview of both, of two shocks, not one but two, back to back. And the fact that we can do that is in itself, I think, an alarming statement about the world that we are in. Furthermore, if we look around the world today, I think it's quite clear at this point that the idea that we have somehow passed out of the active stage of the virus is itself vastly over-optimistic. If you want to assess what the major risks to the global economy are, I'm going to argue this morning, you have to bear in mind that the second largest part of the global economic system, or maybe the third, depending on how you measure it after the United States and Europe, is currently in the grip of a wave of the epidemic which challenges the capacity of Beijing to remain in control. This pandemic is not over. And if you talk to epidemiologists about the risks that we face going forward, the most important illusion for us to give up is the idea that as this virus mutates, it becomes less lethal. The picture I'm going to paint for you this morning, I'm afraid, is alarming. It may be an encouragement to make the best of this summer, in the sense that we live currently in a period, if you like, of relative calm. These are prospective diagnoses. They cannot be any more than that at this point. But I think it is important, if we want to be realistic with ourselves about where we are currently, to bear these potential risks in mind. In disentangling a process of historic change that is unfolding, if you like, beneath our feet as we attempt to find ground, we are constantly shaken. You can take different approaches, and colleagues who've presented papers and studies on this issue that are being presented later this morning were presented yesterday, use the methods of social science, economics, sociology, political science to do this labor of picking over the wreckage of the crisis that we've lived through. I'm going to use the approach of a historian. I'm going to start this morning by telling a story with a series of stages. And the first of those I've pulled together in my book, Shutdown. In this book, what I tried to do was to take the moment of 2020 and organize the various strands that were working their way through the world in 2020 and the series of shocks that were unfolding. And what I want to do this morning for you is to continue that narrative forward into the present moment. Go back to 2020 and then forward. I concluded the book, I felt at the time somewhat cheekily, with the English slang phrase, "We ain't seen nothing yet." There is so much more to come that will continue to act, to destabilize, to render us uncertain. At the time, it felt a little cheeky to end the book this way. I have to say that as time has gone on, I've felt better and better about that conclusion. Because if there is one thing that we have to do right now, I think it is that we have to embrace and understand the sheer radicalism of the potential risks to which we are exposed. The first element of this story is the shock itself. The shock of COVID and the shock that it delivered to the global economy is like nothing we have ever seen before in history. These are weekly data, daily data produced by Goldman Sachs on the basis of lockdown indicators, and they measure global GDP. So this is an aggregate on the scale of about $90 trillion. And what they show as we went into Easter 2020 is the largest single shock to the global economic organism that we have ever seen. That is, ladies and gentlemen, on the left-hand side there, a 20% fall in global GDP. To put this in perspective, a really bad recession up to this point in history is a fall in GDP of 2 or 3 or 4 percentage points. Even a slowdown in growth is bad news for an economy. The contraction of global GDP by 20% in this moment is simply the single largest shock that our collective global economy has ever suffered in history. In countries like India and China, we see unemployment rates surging over 20% in huge labor markets. It is the single largest shock in the history of our collective economic enterprise. For nations like the UK, whose economic statistics go all the way back to the early 1700s, the data show that the break in economic activity in the spring of 2020 is the most severe interruption in economic activity since the early 1700s, at a time when Britain was fighting a furious war against Louis XIV, the Sun King. So we are talking about a historic break. But we have also seen, and the reason why we are all here together this morning, we have also seen an astonishingly rapid recovery from that shock in 2020. We have seen something akin to the V-shaped recovery scenario that economists discussed at the time. The basic impulse here, and I know colleagues will this morning later on present a study which adds a huge amount of valuable nuance to this narrative. The basic story here is in a sense a conservative one of a rebound to the pre-crisis status quo. What we have seen since the low point of the economic shock in the spring of 2020 is a recovery of economic growth driven by the desire to return back to normal. Consumption patterns have largely snapped back to where they were, and where we have seen change, notably in the United States where this has been particularly dramatic, it has been driven by the desire to replicate the old by new means. So one of the things that we've seen in the US in 2020-21 was a huge surge in the demand for goods. Why? Because human services were not available for people to consume. And that led to the third phase of the recovery from 2020. The third phase of the recovery, which immediately manifested itself as a new crisis. And you know what I'm talking about. It is the rippling shock through the supply chain system of the world, which manifested itself by the spring of 2021 already in a dislocation of global energy markets, which saw a huge surge in the price of gas, a key input, obviously, to European consumers. The significance about this point, I think, is that it is important to remind ourselves 12 months on, amidst the incredible chaos and events piling in on ourselves, that the energy crisis that we are facing today did not begin with the war in Ukraine. It began 12 months earlier in the rippling effects of the recovery, above all in Asia. The fundamental shock to the energy system of the world that began in the spring of 2021 is not to do with the manipulation of markets and the politicization of markets by Russia and Putin. It is the result of the lurching entry into global gas markets and above all the LNG market of China, the whale, which as you can see here, overtakes Japan, the traditional main consumer of LNG, in 2021. And at that point, the vulnerability of Europe becomes glaringly obvious. This, in other words, is the operation of market mechanisms to which Europe exposed itself through its energy policy since the early 2000s, and the historic shift in the balance of the world economy towards Asia and above all towards China. This is the third phase of the recovery, immediately entering into what is perceived as a new crisis. And then on top of that comes Russia's war. On top of that comes the threat and the destabilization to global commodity markets produced by Putin's invasion. And the hard core of this, the most serious cause for concern, despite the pressure felt by European consumers in energy markets, is the food supply crisis. But again, the crucial point to make here is that this global crisis in the global food system originated already in 2021 in the global food system. The war itself, I think, is a shock that is of modest proportions when we look at the balance of the global economy. And what I've done here is to compare the two shocks. So here you have COVID as a shock to global GDP, a fall, as you can see, by 20% to the bottom of the spring of 2020. And here on the left-hand side, you have the revision of the IMF's estimates for global GDP in percentage points. So the impact of the war so far on the global economy amounts to a downward revision of 1%, less than 1%, minus 0.8% in global GDP growth, as opposed to a collapse in 20%, which was triggered by COVID. The war and the COVID crisis, though in our minds they've become conflated, are of radically different orders of magnitude in their impact on the world economy. There are two, however, basic concerns here. And the basic one, the most important one, is that the war itself has an extraordinarily violent dynamic, which is destabilizing and potentially profoundly destabilizing. If there is one thing that we know about the war in the current phase, is that the war is not done. The war has to escalate before it can end. And we simply, at this point, cannot gauge the risks that are associated with that. So though the conflict so far, in its effects on the global economy, is driving a shock to the energy market and a shock to the food system, and its overall proportions in GDP terms appear quite modest, we are not understanding the full scale of the risks to the world economy unless we factor in the highly unstable, fluctuating military situation from day to day. And if you want to have a sense of how this is being processed at the center of power in Washington, the testimony of the leading American officials on this score is extremely telling. There seems to have been some shuffling of the slides here, but let me go forward to this. This is the congressional testimony of the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, testifying to the Congress about the risks that the Americans are calculating. The question that everyone is asking right now is, what does Washington know that we don't know? What is it that makes Washington confident in its decision to escalate the war? And this is, one has to bear in mind, is the assessment by the Director of National Intelligence of the situation. The uncertain nature of the battle, which is developing into a war of attrition, combined with the reality that Putin faces a mismatch between his ambitions and Russia's current conventional military capabilities, likely means that the next few months could see us moving along a more unpredictable and potentially escalatory trajectory. That, I think, is the phrase that really sticks in our minds at the current moment. So in the fourth phase of the crisis that we're currently in, what we're seeing is an open-ended military escalation, the downsides of which could spiral in a truly catastrophic way over the coming months. So the estimates that I showed you of the IMF's predictions of global GDP may turn out to be extremely optimistic. If I backpedal to this slide here, what we are faced with having to do is price in existential risk to the global economy. What we are seeing is an economy shocked by global raw material flows being disconcerted. We are seeing the risk of an energy boycott, the risk of a deflationary shock running through the European economy, and the prospect, the potential that this could escalate towards a much more serious nuclear confrontation. This, the fourth phase of the crisis that we have been living through. And the fifth element of my gloomy, pessimistic analysis this morning of my anxiety about the current moment as a kind of period of calm before a potential storm is the ongoing epidemic. It is easy, I think, for us in Europe, perhaps particularly in a society like Portugal, which managed the early phase of the pandemic so well, that was blindsided perhaps over the winter of 2020-21, but has nevertheless seen quite modest mortality. There is a sense, I think, that the major phase of the crisis has passed. But it is very important to remind ourselves that as recently as February 2022, in other words, just a matter of months ago, we were at this peak here. 10,000 people a day, 10,000 people a day worldwide were still falling victim to this disease, and that's the official number, not the estimated excess mortality. This is the official number of registered casualties of the disease at that point. We have now seen, of course, a major lull, which is the period of calm that we are living through at this current moment. But from the point of view of the global economy, that lull is in a sense a false calm, because the real risk at this moment is, of course, not to Europe or the United States, but to China. And the source of that risk hangs in this rather, it can be traced back to this rather extraordinary and revealing graph. This is the rate of vaccination for Chinese people by age. And the fundamental mistake made by Beijing over the period of 2021 in particular was not to concentrate vaccination on the elderly population. So in virtually every other society in the world, these bars run the other way. Older people are more vaccinated. In China, as the Omicron wave hit China in the spring of 2022, it turned out that the most vulnerable people, those most in danger from the disease, were in fact least vaccinated. So a narrative of the global pandemic that was anchored from 2020 onwards on the shocking, humiliating, humbling realization that China had in fact managed the crisis best, and which tipped each European society, one after the other. The victors of 2020 became the losers of 2021. Germany, the East Europeans, and so on. Now, in 2022, looks set to claim the Chinese as well. This epidemic, from the point of view of the global economy, is not over. Because if the lockdown in China continues, it will have a dramatic impact on world demand and the world economy. The inflationary pressure sweeping through the world, through commodity markets, through food prices and energy prices, is increasingly going to be offset in a precarious balance that it will be incredibly hard to determine by deflationary forces coming from the Chinese economy. Here are the latest data for major real estate markets across China, and as you can see, they are suffering a huge collapse in demand, a huge retreat from the rapid acceleration in real estate prices that we have seen that have dominated the Chinese economy in recent years. It is not too much to say that the urbanization of China since 2000, the incorporation of a population of hundreds of millions of people into the Chinese cities at middle income level is the single most dramatic development in the world economy in our history collectively. It is the single largest surge of wealth that we have ever seen. The Chinese regime in 2021 deliberately set out to take the steam out of this escalation of monetary and economic pressure. The results we can see in the falling rate of increase in the prices of real estate across China. And now they face the problem of managing that slow downward movement, that recession in the Chinese housing market in the middle of a lockdown. Why this matters so much for the world economy is visible from this slide here. So what you have are the share of demand for iron ore from the Chinese economy as a whole. So it is a staggering fact that almost 75% of the global demand for iron ore comes from the Chinese economy, and of that, half, roughly speaking, 30%, is from the Chinese real estate sector, just the Chinese real estate sector. Between 2010 and 2013, China poured more concrete than the United States in the entire 20th century. In 3 years, more than the United States in an entire century. Why? Because China was going through this incredible urbanization drive. If this is coming to a halt, and the Chinese authorities find no way of restarting the engine of growth, it will send a shock throughout the emerging market economies, the likes of which we have not seen in decades. The inflationary pressures that preoccupy the European mind when it comes to the current economic situation will be offset by very severe deflationary pressures for economies like Brazil, Australia, Indonesia, currently benefiting from the huge surge in commodity prices. This is a powerful and extremely negative shock. So you can see the way in which our story of a huge COVID recession followed by a rapid recovery has given way across three different dimensions: the dislocation of supply chains, the surge in the price of food and raw materials beginning already in 2021, Putin's war, which came on top of that and exacerbated tensions in what were already extremely fragile markets, and now the wave of the pandemic sweeping through the Chinese economy, which is destabilizing what has been the major driver of global growth in recent months. All of them add up to an extremely precarious situation, none of whose consequences are yet fully felt. That's the crucial point that I'm trying to make this morning. On the one hand, there are these risks there, and none of them have yet fully worked their way through. Not the restriction in the surge in prices and inflation that we are seeing, not the war, which could escalate in ways which are extremely dangerous, and not the tumbling of the Chinese economic miracle that we have seen in recent months. And on top of that, we have now to deal with a further shock, monkeypox. Now, I induce monkeypox and adduce monkeypox not because I think that monkeypox is going to be a killer disease that we'll all be dealing with for months to come, but because monkeypox is precisely the sort of crisis that we should expect to see in the current world. COVID is not, as it were, a one-off. I think it's very misleading to think of it as simply a century shock that we are never going to see again. COVID is much better understood as a highly predictable shock, the likes of which we should expect to see repeated over and over again. So it's no accident that whilst we're still struggling with the final wave of COVID, we should be confronted with alarming news about new diseases beginning to destabilize public health around the world. We live, ladies and gentlemen, in an environment profoundly destabilized by our deep, disruptive interaction with nature. There are, roughly speaking, 10,000 candidates for zoonotic mutation out there, which we should expect to destabilize our world. We tend to think about this in terms of the massively destabilizing effect of climate change, but when we think about problems of biodiversity, pollution, and zoonotic mutation, we get a clearer idea of the range of forces destabilizing the envelope of security that we take for granted every day. So even if monkeypox in the end remains a symbol of the world of destabilization that we live in, we should take it seriously as such. It is a useful reminder, it seems to me, if China was not enough, that this risk that we have come through remains out there as a major threat. So the organizers asked me to discuss more constructively whether we have moved forward in any constructive way on measures that might make the world more secure than the world that we currently inhabit. And there are no doubt, a series of major blueprints out there which suggest all the obvious things that we should do. We should build systems of early warning. We should build zoonotic mutation risk committees like we do for banks. We should build reserve capacity for vaccine production. We should expand the redundancy of our healthcare systems. We should be spending 10, 15, maybe $20 billion a year in global pandemic preparedness so as to give ourselves a better chance of responding to the next crisis. And you can go to the G7 or the G20 and read the extremely serious reports on this situation and the need to respond with deep investment. The problem is, however, that we also have to deal with a humbling reality, which is that we succeeded in developing the magic bullet that saved us, that enabled us to meet in the way that we are today. We succeeded in the extraordinary program of vaccine development, which put us in the position of meeting in the way we are, and then we failed. And we failed in delivering vaccines to the world. This is the ranking as of late May of the delivery of vaccines to the global population. This is a familiar chart, but is one that we should force back into our consciousness again and again and again. Because what it shows is that whether or not you were given safety against COVID depended on whether you were in the developed world or not. I have 4 vaccines in my arm. A third of the population of the world has none at this particular moment. Or take these numbers. A shocking contrast that came to me while I was preparing this talk. Let us bring the war in. Let us treat the vaccine pandemic emergency as though it was analogous to the war in Ukraine. I'm not suggesting that this is a very serious comparison, but it is revealing, I think, of the capacity of the world community, and specifically the West, to mobilize dramatic resources for a geopolitical confrontation with Russia, $40 billion voted by the American Congress in recent weeks, and on the other hand, on the left-hand side there, the IMF's best estimate of the cost of a global vaccination campaign, $10 billion more. The IMF's estimate of the return to an investment in global vaccination runs into trillions and trillions of dollars. And nevertheless, we were not capable of mobilizing those resources. Over a 5-year period, that G20 program called for $75 billion of public health investment worldwide. Compare that with the $20 billion that was voted by the G7 for the support of Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't spend the money in Ukraine. What I am saying is that it absolutely beggars belief that these numbers here these resources here have not actually been mobilized in the current situation. Congress has failed even to vote resources in the United States for America's own vaccination program. We have a global summit commitment that was produced in May 2022 in this year, and you can see the figures that are involved. $3.2 billion were mobilized by a summit convened by the United States, 1/10 of what's actually needed, 1/10 of what's actually being voted for the war with Russia. There is a huge disproportion here, and there is also increasing interaction between the two elements. I was at Davos earlier this week, and it was quite clear, talking to the African delegates there, that if you wanted a single explanation for why African countries refused to sign up to the West's appeal to ostracize and sanction Russia, for all their sympathy for the Ukrainians, they were profoundly reluctant to agree to measures and to resolutions that, as it were, legitimized and endorsed the Western-led world order. Why? Because it had not delivered for them when it came to vaccines. In other words, there is spillover between these different dimensions of crises in the world right now. What has this crisis uncovered about the world economy at large in a deeper structural sense? One thing it has shown is that development, as we're saying with the vaccines, is highly uneven. And this has negative and also positive sides. Africa remains unvaccinated, but India emerged in the course of the crisis as one of the great vaccine producers of the world. We are not dealing with a world which is simply poor and underdeveloped. We are dealing with a world full of potential, full of capacity for sophisticated production, which is not being mobilized effectively with the leadership and resources from the Western world that we owe ourselves and the rest of the world. One of the other things that the crisis exposed is a profound unevenness in labor market development, a profound persistence of informality as the great dominating factor in global labor markets. When we think about global labor markets, we should not extrapolate rich country conditions. We should understand that the vast majority of people worldwide live and work in informal circumstances, which meant that a consistent response to the pandemic was almost impossible for them, given their material reality. We should also not be confused about any claim to similarity between Europe and the United States. This is evident to us and will become evident, and I'm going to focus on this in just a second as I round up. We will focus in short, by the fall, on the political differences between Europe and the United States. They will become very evident as the Republicans sweep back to power in Washington. But we also need to appreciate the difference in social system. So what this data from the BIS show you is an extraordinarily interesting contrast. So here you have the impact of the global recession caused by COVID on both the US and the Euro area labour market. And you can see that in both cases it led to roughly a 15 to 20% reduction in labour input. But in the United States, that came in the form of mass unemployment, and in Europe it was absorbed into short-time working systems. We live, in other words, in radically different societies with different capacities for economic and political organization, which are reflected in the politics of the two supposed partners in the global system. That world of massive unevenness, however, and this is the lesson that we simply cannot allow ourselves to forget, is totally interconnected through travel. The simplest lesson to take away from COVID 2020 is that something that happens in a major Chinese provincial city matters urgently to everyone in the world. And furthermore, our economy is underpinned by a system of production and exchange which is unfathomably complicated. This is most evident when we think about vaccines, which go from the cellular level of the human organism to a truck on the right-hand side of this supply chain. In other words, what the global economy does is to stitch together 7.9 billion people living at incredibly unequal levels through massively speeded up transport, where in extremis, we need not just to put something in somebody's arm, but to manipulate the biochemistry of all 7.9 billion people on the planet and organize a supply chain to do this. And what that tells you, and one of the huge shocks of the crisis, is that our conventional economics will simply not do to describe this world, because the macroeconomic aggregates through which we understand and shape our understanding of the world economy do not allow us to track from the cellular level to the level of $50, $60 billion worth of spending and its implications for the world economy. We have a huge cognitive gap that has been exposed by this crisis, which in and of itself poses a great challenge for political leadership and policy leadership in years to come. I'm going to wrap up with the final question which the organizers posed to me, which is, can we use the learnings of the crisis to do better the next time around? If we can assess the complexity of the challenge that we face, can we respond to this crisis? And for me, the central problem here is, what is the we that is appealed to at this moment? Who or what is that? Let us go back to that excellent report, The Global Deal for Our Pandemic Age, a fantastic report describing the measures that are necessary, the $75 billion budget. Well, look in the bottom left-hand corner, you can't quite see it. Report of the G20 high-level independent panel. And then think to yourself, what at this moment is the G20? Well, this is the G20 this spring in Washington, D.C. That's the atrium of the IMF building. That's Janet Yellen, Christine Lagarde, and a bunch of other famous figures. And they have just walked out of a G20 meeting at protest at the appearance of the Russian financial officials in that meeting. The G20 is dead as a global political organization at this moment. And so, what is the we that will implement that pandemic report? One answer, of course, is to go to the G7. The old 1970s era organization. But the problem, of course, is where is the United States going to be as a player in the G7 by November 2022? If you're asking yourself how this will matter, well, think about one of the significant achievements of the G7 OECD countries in thinking about a better world since the crisis. And that consisted in the agreement of 130 countries to support a global minimum tax. If you spoke candidly to the Republican Congress people at Davos this week, what they would tell you is, come the fall, it's dead. It's not happening. The ability of the American political system to underwrite constructive action at the G7 level is going to retreat to Trumpian levels next year. And what that means, and I'm going to sound like an expat enthusiast for the EU here, but I simply don't see any other alternative option, is that the EU, if you want to answer this question of where the potential for a constructive response to the crisis comes from, it's here. It's in Europe. It's in the leadership of the politics and economics of this continent. And to give a crucial and key example of this, it is the short-time working program that was adopted by Europe with such success during the COVID crisis. It strikes me as a hugely underrated and underestimated innovation in welfare. and it is one that is being adopted around the world as an example. If Europe invented the welfare state in the late 19th century, it is beginning to reinvent it for the 21st century, and it seems to me that it is something that Europe should embrace as a politics. Next Gen EU sets the course for climate change policy, digital spending and climate policy, organizing EU spending. And this is, of course, now not counteracted as climate policy is in the United States with the war with Russia, but supercharged by it. But I think there is a huge risk here, and I want to end by warning about this, because the enthusiasm in Europe right now for the energy transition is being compounded by the desire to escape the dependence on Russia. But I think it would be a huge mistake to recast Europe's climate policy as essentially complementary to a Cold War agenda of bloc formation. Why? Because that policy could be the basis for cooperation. It could be the basis for cooperation with China over PV and EV. It's very difficult to imagine a future for either without cooperation with China. It should be the basis for cooperation with Brazil and Latin America over the Amazon and rare earths. And it should be the basis of cooperation with Africa, Europe's closest and most important neighbor in future, in the agenda of sustainable development. So rather than thinking of Next Gen EU as the preface to a new, if you like, green-infused Cold War, we need to keep the channels of communication open. And I mean that not just in a pragmatic and specific sense, but in a much more general sense, and this is the point I really will conclude with. If we want to answer the question of how we make a we that's capable of action, there are ways of thinking about that problem in political theory that come from identity, that come from the fact that we are all white, that we are all European, that we are all Christian, for instance, as a kind of foundationalist notion of identity. Or we can constitute a we through a set of common values that we all share. But both of those routes are limiting, inherently limiting. The challenge, I think, of the coming moment is to redefine problems, shared problems in which the solution of which we have common interests, as being the basis for the constitution of a powerful we. And the climate problem and the pandemic problem, to my mind, take on a new and unexpectedly constructive and positive meaning if you think of them that way. We may not be able to agree with the Chinese about very much, except the fact that we agree on the need for pandemic control and CO2 reduction. And that, I think, is the way in which one would hope that these problems can be recast, not as the foundation for division, but as common problems to work on. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much for coming this morning.